Hello there. G'day. Well, welcome. I think that when this segment was originally put together by John and Tim and the conveners of the Friedman Conference, it was assumed quite understandably that Labor would win the May 18 federal election, and that our guest today would be the new member for Reid. But it was an understandable assessment because, as you know, all the polling, all the betting markets, all the pundits virtually predicted a pretty comfortable Labor lead and win. But such is the magic of politics.
The magic of politics.
The coalition defied the odds, and so we're here today. In my judgment, and this is not an isolated view, but Sam Crosby, who ran for the Sydney seat of Reid and won, I think, something between a 1.5% swing in his favour. He didn't win this time, but I think it's fair to say that he's a future member of the Labor Parliament and a Labor government, probably a Labor minister as well. And I think one of the reasons why Sam was invited here today, as John just alluded to, is that in recent times we've seen the Federal Labor Party lurch to the left on some economic issues. Certainly under Bill Shorten's leadership that was the case. Long gone are the days of the Hawke-Keating leadership. That's the widely held view. Well, Sam in many respects comes from that Hawke-Keating tradition. He's the executive director of the McKell think tank. It's a public policy research organisation. And before that, Sam was in senior management at Johnson & Johnson. Please welcome Sam. Sam, great to have you here.
Goodish to be here.
Well, you're a warrior for turning up, that's for sure. Now, 26 years ago, John Hewson and the Federal Liberal Coalition lost the unlosable election. It's widely believed because they put forward a big picture, big target strategy of a GST, a 15% GST, privatisation, a hardcore economic rationalist agenda. Why, 26 years later, did Bill Shorten lose the unlosable election in your judgment?
Maybe because people started running around thinking it was the unlosable election. Every election's losable. I guess I should say at the outset here, I have no idea, right? It's always easy in the post-election wrap-ups to run around and say, well, if only we'd done X, Y and Z. If it was that easy, people like me would have been saying all this sort of stuff well and truly beforehand, during the election campaign, before the election campaign, and maybe we would have had a different result. So I caveat everything I say with saying, who knows? I think for a large part of it, we gave the voting public so much to chew that ultimately I think they choked and said, nah, this is just too big. We had policies that we were announcing, billion-dollar, big show-stopping policies. We announced a solar schools program, a program to spend $1 billion on getting on putting solar panels on schools. We announced this something like the week or a week and a half before the election. No one I spoke to heard about this thing. Now this should be in past days a big signature sort of a policy, but you announce it in the midst of tens of billions of dollars being spent in every other area. No one sees this.
What about John Howard's point, and he's not alone, that Labor going after the big end of town? You know, it's true that Labor did want to increase taxes on property investors, self-funded retirees, and certainly high-income wealth creators. Is that a fair argument?
It's not unfair, no. Look, so speaking about my seat of Reid, so Reid is in sort of inner west of Sydney, and when you walk around, it's got, these giant mansions in some parts of the electorate. They are very, very nice places. I never once in my campaign referred to the big end of town. At one stage, some social media kid put up a video online and unrelated to anything that I was saying in the video, referred to the big end of town in the prelude. And I called them up and I'm saying, pull it down. Like, have you seen what Reid is? We are the definition of the big end of town, right? But taking a step back away from my own seat, it is divisive. It is a divisive term to say the big end of town. It pits one side against the other, and I think somewhere deep down in who we are as a country, we don't like that. We want to see a unifying figure, a unifying government. I think there are ways that we could have sold that agenda better.
And certainly Hawke and Keating from 83 to 96, broadly speaking, were about consensus, reaching out to all segments in the policy agenda, including the big end of town. Absolutely. There was no division there. Yeah. And even Kevin Rudd, people forget this, but of course in 2007 when he beat John Howard, he styled himself as an economic conservative, which meant free markets and fiscal discipline.
But again, as part of that, remember, he stood up and said, the reckless spending must stop after accepting 95% or 97% or something of Howard's expenditure. But that's what I'm talking about. The way he sold it was clever. Yeah. Was clever.
Do you think that Shorten and the Labor Party leadership this time felt that they could get away with beating up on the big end of town because they see what's happening around the world? You see Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, Bernie Sanders in the United States, to some extent Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand and Justin Trudeau in Canada. Have left-of-centre parties around the world moved further to the left on these economic issues?
No, I think it was a frog in a pot situation. At every possible benchmark, at every possible point, Bill passed the test. Every by-election, every election, he got a bit closer. The polls didn't betray him. The polls kept staying 52-48, 53-47. So at every stage, we sort of added another degree or two to the water to continue the hackneyed cliche. But, by the end, it was pretty clear that the thing was cooked. I'm not sure. Everyone likes to put these analogies together. I'm not sure it holds. Australia's Australia. Canada's Canada. Let each country be their own thing. I'm not sure there is a single thread that you can
although
connect
during the
through.
80s and 90s, you had the Thatcher era, the Reagan era, Hawke and Keating, all promoting reducing the size and the scope of the government. There was a philosophical thread then. Couldn't you argue from a left-of-centre perspective that we're seeing Labor and socialist parties moving further to the left on economics? I mean, Jeremy Corbyn's talking about nationalising certain industries.
Yeah, but I mean, look, a lot of people around the Labor Party look at what's going on in England with aghast. I don't. In all the conversations I've had with Chris Bowen, and I've had many conversations, not once did we say, "Hey, look at Jeremy Corbyn." That's something we should do.
Mind you, there was a front page story in the Australian a few days ago of Anthony Albanese with Jeremy Corbyn. We won't start. Let's turn to multiculturalism, because the electorate of Reid is a very multicultural electorate. What's the breakdown, roughly, the ethnic breakdown?
So about 20% Chinese.
20% Chinese.
20% Chinese, 6% Korean, 6% sort of loosely dubbed subcontinent, which is predominantly Tamil, but also Indian, Sri Lankan, Nepalese. Maronites about 5%. Italians and Greeks, 4 or 5% each.
Okay, now how did religious freedom, this is a big libertarian issue for many people in this room, how did religious freedom play in that electorate?
So it's a good point. So there was a great article in, I think it was the SMH, I think it was Andrew West the other day, where it talked about you can't understand multiculturalism without understanding religion. So a lot of these groups are deeply religious. Not groups. A lot of these individuals are deeply religious people, and so you can't understand, their psyche and what makes them tick without going through a religious frame at some level. Now, in the various closed door meetings that we had with senior people from the Labor Party and senior church leaders, every assurance was given that we weren't after religious freedoms. The problem wasn't a policy. The problem was that we had those meetings behind closed doors, and we didn't send up some of our, more prominent leaders like Bill or whoever to say that publicly. So I think by the end, a lot of the church leaders, especially in Reid, were actually quite comfortable with the assurances we were given, but none of their congregants were. There needs to be, if there's going to be an exemption drawn, a subjective line drawn, right? But we can't do that. Government can never do that. That has to be done by the church leaders. And if we can't reach consensus on that, then we should stop.
What was the breakdown roughly of the same-sex marriage vote in the electorate of Reid?
So it followed a east-west axis. So it was 52% in favour, but that was predominantly frankly, the Liberal voting end of the electorate in the Drummoyne, and that sort of follows.
So the more Labor-oriented it got, and it was more likely to be anti-gay marriage.
Yeah, so Blaxland was, I think, the worst performing yes vote in the country. We share a border Reid and Blaxland share a border. So the further closer you get to Blaxland, obviously, the worse our vote went.
Now, Sam, you mentioned Andrew West, who hosts a very good radio national show on religious freedom issues, and he wrote this piece in the Herald, and he said, quote, "A week before the federal election, one of the most senior figures in the Conservative leadership of the Sydney Anglican Church made a revealing, some might say prophetic comment. Canon Bruce Morrison of St John's Anglican Cathedral in Parramatta told the Sydney Morning Herald that he supported Labor's economic policies of wealth redistribution, but he could not vote Labor because of its apparent lack of commitment to religious freedom."
Yeah, we're asking people. I mean, there are a lot of very progressive people in the Catholic Church, in Christian churches. You know, it's their progressivism that leads them to follow Christ. But we were asking them to choose between their God and their, social conscience, if you like. It's not a choice we should ever ask anyone to make.
So how should Labor deal with the question of religious freedom over the next 3 years? Because I noticed that Chris Bowen came out, front page story in Sydney's Daily Telegraph this week, making the point, God help us, saying that this issue really did hurt the Labor Party in these seats.
Yeah. Tony Blair, I remember, once said he had a three-part strategy. It was to reassure, and reassure. I didn't see us doing much of that on any issues, including religious freedoms, during this last campaign. We were presenting ourselves as the big change. That I think worries a lot of people. And so as part of that, I think the first thing we need to do is reassure. I don't ever think we should rush in to make big changes like this unless we've got, I would say, firstly, both parties, a bipartisan consensus. But to get that, we're going to need, the various churches along for the ride.
Let's put this election result in a global context. This is the New York Times. This is how they interpreted the result on Saturday last week. The coalition's performance amounted to another swell in the wave of populist fervour that swept Trump into office and set Britain on a path out of the European Union. Is that really plausible? Because Australia's had 27, 28 years of uninterrupted growth. We had a huge income boom from the 80s until probably the end of the commodities boom in 2011. And we've had a pretty secure border protection policy that boosts public confidence in large-scale non-discriminatory immigration. You don't have that kind of confidence in those parts of Europe and America where Trump did really well. So is the New York Times overstating their case here?
I think so. It's easy to write that, and it's a nice narrative to construct. You've got 1, 2, 3, the centre-right wins, the polls get it all wrong. It's easy to write. I don't think it's right, though. I don't think it's right. You tell me. You look through the election campaign that Scott Morrison ran, it has nothing in common with the election campaign.
Draining the swamp.
Trump. That's right. It was nothing like that. It was a small target strategy. His whole thing was shrinking down, making the Labor Party the big ogre, the big thing that's going to come and take your tax dollars and whatever else. I saw a Harcher's article yesterday or today, even talking about how later on the campaign he removed his the baseball hat, because again that was too attention grabbing, and he just wanted to be the small figure behind the big Bill Shorten figure. Smart strategy, it worked. Can't fault it. But that is not a Donald Trump or a Brexit sort of a.
On the other hand, though, you could argue, couldn't you, that there is a Trump Brexit sort of feel to this election in the sense that the polls got it so wrong, and perhaps there are some people. The so-called shy voter, or as the Prime Minister calls them, quiet Australians. They say one thing to pollsters because they don't want to be labelled as being a deplorable, but in the privacy of the ballot booth, they'll give the middle finger to the establishment.
Yeah.
Is that plausible?
So look, this is really one of those questions where I have to say I have no idea. It doesn't feel right because it's never happened at any other election, right? When Tony Abbott was elected, when John Howard was elected and re-elected, at no other point did we have this sort of difference. You do have it with One Nation. That is a demonstrable effect. But
it's 5% of the vote, if that, right?
Yeah, but you don't have that when it comes to a mainstream Conservative Party yet, I think. But it brings to...
How do you account for the fact that the polls were so badly wrong?
This is the point. I don't know. A friend put to me the other week, and I should say everyone's polls were wrong, right? This revisionist history crap about, Crosby Textor knew what was going on and their internals were right. Bullshit, right? Bullshit. I spoke to someone who was actually with the Prime Minister in Kirribilli House. He was one of about, I don't know, a few people that were in there. And he says, if anyone tries to revise history and say that we knew what we were doing, we knew that this was coming, it's complete crap. We all just sat there in stunned silence, right? But good on them. The victors get to rewrite the history, and they get to write the history, so fine. But a friend, is that a sign? A friend put to me a little while ago, there is a large amount of undecideds in any of these polls. Now, the traditional way that you handle these this group is you assume a standard split of them. It is possible that the polls only got it wrong a couple of percent. It is possible that in the last coming weeks of the campaign, for whatever reasons, a large number or a greater proportion of those went conservative rather than the Labor Party. It's possible, but I don't know.
Okay, what about our politics? Is it broken? Is politics broken? Because if you think about that period from 1983 when Hawke was elected right through to the end of John Howard's long reign in 2007, that period from 83 to 07, all things considered, and I think this is a general consensus, there was good economic policy leadership, good political leadership generally speaking. But since Howard, so in the last 12 years now, we've had Rudd, Gillard, Abbott, Turnbull, and then Morrison. And meanwhile, we've seen this toxic political polarisation. It's obviously not just confined to Australia, it's happening all around the world, particularly in Washington and Westminster. To what extent is our political system broken, Sam?
Well, I'm an optimist, right? I can't want to be getting into politics and thinking it's broken. Otherwise, I'd just say, well, let's go do something else, right? So it might be completely stuffed, but I can't think that, right? And I don't think that. I think I don't want to dance on Tony Abbott's grave, but I do think he was a particularly pernicious force in Australian politics.
Even though he won a pretty big landslide in 2013.
Yeah, no. He did. We deserved to lose that election. I don't think he deserved to win that election, but we deserved to lose that election. We'd spent 6 years focused on, for not insubstantial parts, focused on ourselves. That was certainly the perception we gave. Now, I think a lot of ministers were doing very good work, but the perception, the narrative, well, it is what it is. I can't believe that we can't get reform. Now, my great hope was for Bill to rewrite a model from opposition, that you can take an honest approach to say, here is what we are going to do, right? It was Hawke and Keating that wrote the playbook, that you go out and you promise the world, you get in, you discover a budget emergency and a budget problem, and then you use that to discount all your promises. And that playbook has largely been continued on. It had been my fervent hope that this was going to be one of the first times that an opposition could win, saying openly and honestly, yes, here's what we're going to do. Now, I think there were problems with presenting what should have been a 9 or 12-year economic agenda in one whack. I think that was a problem. But in terms of having an open approach and saying, no, there is going to be some pain here, and here is what we're going to do, I gotta believe that you can win honestly.
Well, on that note, it seems quite obvious that the politics of climate change makes the point the system's broken, because Rudd promised an ETS, an emissions trading scheme. He ditched that when Abbott became the leader after Copenhagen in 2009-2010. And then, of course, Gillard failed on the carbon tax because Abbott repealed it. And in this election, and then, of course, Malcolm Turnbull was basically dumped on the National Energy Guarantee. And you could make the argument, although the climate change issue resonated in a lot of safe metropolitan electorates, like you think of Kooyong and Higgins in Melbourne, or certainly Wentworth and North Sydney, and even Warringah, big issue there for a lot of the Well Hill people. But if you go out to Cessnock, a big Labor seat, this is Joel Fitzgibbon's seat, huge swings against the Labor Party. Go to central and northern Queensland, these are very energy intensive areas, big backlash against Labor's energy and climate policy. So where does the politics of climate change fit in here going forward?
So this is a huge question. I think to answer it, you need to break down what you're actually talking about, right? So I think there's the renewable energy argument, and I think that is not broken. That is, we can figure out a path forward on that. And I think there's the climate change argument. I'm not anti-coal. I'm not anti-coal. I think our generators here are old, and need to be replaced, and there is a question about what are we going to replace them with. Are we going to, replace them with 100-year-old technology, or are we going to replace them with something else? That's how I see the energy mix argument. Now, I see no contradiction in exporting and continuing to use in generators that are still old enough here, or still young enough here, continuing to use high-quality Australian coal. I see no contradiction in that. I have a problem with
But some of your colleagues in the Labor Party do take issue with you, like Richard Marles on the eve of the election. I think
that was a corker, wasn't it?
And what was his line about coal? Coal, he wanted to stop exporting it, even though it accounts for a lot of export dollars.
Yeah, I don't know. You'd have to talk to Richard.
Okay, let's take some questions. John.
I'm trying to get him to throw people under the bus, as is the next questioner. To what degree do you think personality could have played a role in this, and particularly here, it's seemingly, according to the polls, if we were to believe them, it seemed that Bill Shorten was personally unpopular. Would that be part of the explanation, without trying to throw him under the bus?
No, look, I mean, I really like Bill. I've known Bill for many, many, many years. So I wouldn't throw him under the bus. Obviously, it affected it. Obviously, it did. You can say that pretty comprehensively. One of my favourite experiments in the US is the kindergartner test of predicting presidential outcomes, where they get a group of kindergartners, they hold up 2 pictures of presidential candidates, and with freakish accuracy, these kindergartners who know nothing at all about the parties, the policies, or anything like that, pick who the winner is going to be. There is some sort of deep primal level of something going on in our brains that we look at someone and we say, he's trustworthy, she's not, he's trustworthy, he's not, whatever it is, right? So I think, yes, something like that was going on.
I should stress, though, in 1996, all the available polling evidence showed that although Howard smashed Keating in the general election, Keating was still more popular than John Howard by 10 points.
Yeah, and that was in the lead up to it, that was the result that I would keep going back to. I always hoped that he was going to be our Howard. I mean, everyone forgets with Howard. We all lionise Howard now. We all forget that for that first, term, really 2 terms, hugely unpopular figure. It was only in sort of, terms, 3 onwards that we all looked at him and said, oh, this guy actually knows what he's doing. He's cunning, he's smart, I saw that in Bill, that I would hope that over time, once he got in, he could entrench himself and people would see him as being a decent person, blah, blah, blah.
Well, he certainly had a very good best man at his wedding.
Well, say that is.
John Rossman, I believe. Is he in the room? John?
That is a small world. John Rossman was best man for Bill Shorten.
Well, you know this.
Yeah, I know. I'm just making sure everyone knows. I mean, that's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, small world.
It sounds that opposites can attract.
Well, it shows that people can still be friends when they disagree, as long as they're not the regressive left. We have a question here from a US Democratic presidential candidate, Buttigieg. Although I think our version is called Buttigieg. I don't know how you pronounce your surname. Sorry, Ralph. If the Labor Party was to rediscover or perhaps re-emphasise more Keating pro-market style reforms, would they be at risk of losing all the inner city to the Greens?
It's a good question.
Thank you. Wasn't mine.
No, it's a good question. I mean, it's hard to look at the Greens as anything other than a spent force in Australian politics. Richo wrote the other day that at every election where they've been put to the test, their share of vote has been declining. I don't see them as having terribly many answers, and yet in those inner city electorates where, frankly, people don't need government services, they don't need, they are very wealthy, they can afford to vote on those issues that are of importance to them. And, I don't know how important many of those issues are to people, in Western Sydney.
Are you familiar with Lindsay Tanner's new book about, it's a novel, Lindsay Tanner, the former finance minister in the Gillard-Rudd governments, but or the Rudd government, I should say, he's written a book about how identity politics and the Greens are just increasingly just confined to these metropolitan areas, and they're so out of touch with the thoughts and attitudes of the Labor heartland. And this is only going to get worse.
I mean, I think we're not going to have to wait long to see if it can be, if that divide can be crossed. And I say that with reference to Anthony Albanese. He'll be the next leader, obviously. He's got an inner city seat. He's been winning these guys over for a long period of time, 20-something years. We'll see.
Isn't that a challenge, though, that someone who's so popular with the metropolitan sophisticates in his own inner city area, how does someone like Albanese resonate with a lot of more conservative Queenslanders?
Yeah, I mean, to say that, you've got to know Anthony. And if you know Anthony, you get the appeal. He and I are obviously not in the same part of the party. He's in the hard left, I'm in the right. But if you ever see him with a crowd of people, he has a rare ability in politics, which is range. He can sit down with your Bonos and your rock stars one day and go out and have a beer with a bunch of miners in rural Queensland the next. But he's got range. That's an impressive ability in any politician.
And it'd be interesting to see how he does on that kindergarten test, I think. I suspect he'd do okay. I don't know if Tim told you what you were getting in for when you came along to this conference. I know, especially from a Labor background, it may look like the conference is designed for the blue socialists instead of the red socialists here. Sorry, the Liberal Party instead of the Labor Party here. But it is a libertarian conference. So as a libertarian conference, at least historically, people who got active in politics, there's not as many of them now, but there was previously a bunch of libertarian-leaning people attracted to the Labor Party, so much so that it even coined a name, Labortarian. And there were a few floating around. And another question in here, given the current context, is there a future for libertarians in the Labor Party? Is it a party that libertarians should still look to?
Look, it depends what motivates you. It depends what motivates you. I mean, are you being honest and genuine about your beliefs, or are you just a liberal dressed up in libertarians' clothes?
I just called them blue socialists.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question. If you're actually interested in lower tax takes, then you'd be preferencing at least the Labor Party. I mean, both Gillard Rudd and Hawke Keating had lower tax per tax to GDP share of the economy than John Howard did, considerably. If that's the thing that motivates you, sure. If you're interested in focusing on transgender issues, look at Mark Latham's speech to his maiden speech. I'm not that's right to the New South Wales Upper House. I'm not going to talk about transgender issues. He then proceeds to talk about transgender issues for 10 minutes. If that's your caper, well, sure. But it's not mine.
Fair enough. It's not my place. I always say that, and then I say something anyway. I think it's the spending as a percentage of GDP is the more accurate measure of the size of government. But anyway, different topic. Where's the next one here? Oh, basically one word: nuclear. Nuclear power, is that something that should be starting to be considered in the Australian energy mix?
Yeah, so the great myth about nuclear power, right? There is a 20-year lag on building a generator. So even if you came up tomorrow and said, here is a part of Sydney or a part of wherever that can happily take a nuclear reactor, and show me where that is first before we bother to go down this next path, there is a 20-year lag to getting this thing built and operational. I mean, for heaven's sake, in 20 years we can do a lot of stuff other than nuclear power. I'm not opposed to nuclear power for its own sake. It's got an emissions profile, it's got an energy profile, it's got its pros, its cons, whatever else. I think we shouldn't approach, with such religious zeal the any energy mix. Morrison standing up saying it's coal. What a wanker, But similarly, the demonisation that we approach coal with, or we approach nuclear with, it's silly. I look at it purely from an economic perspective and a practicality perspective that says it's not a real thing.
Is it fair to say the Liberal Democrats are the only party that supports nuclear energy?
It wouldn't be fair to say it. I would say it. I'll just say it so that you all vote Liberal Democrat. I believe there's a few other little ones out there that also agree with us.
Except for every ex-leader, you know. As soon as John Howard finishes, you know what, nuclear, I think that's the way. Bob Carr, Bob Hawke, you know, as soon as they leave office, I think nuclear is the way to go. They never say that when they're in the job, do they?
As a general rule at this conference, some of our favourite people are ex-politicians. They tend to get a lot better from our perspective anyway. Last question then. With a new leader coming up, assuming it's Albo, is it already confirmed?
It's not confirmed, but I don't see anyone, frankly, that can beat him.
All right, well, that is the context. What do you think is going to happen with Labor's approach to Adani? Will it stop Adani, stay indecisive, pro-Adani, or a fourth option, if you can think of one?
Oh, look, I mean, all this focus on Adani, you know, since it's been downsized in its capacity, you know, we've passed 2 other mines of similar size in this time that we've been having this argument. It's become this sort of this figurehead for all the future of coal. It's not. I mean, I think the bigger problem with Adani is I don't see how it pays for itself. I don't see how the economics of it stack up. You've got you know, so I worked on the Hunter Valley Coal Chain Agreement when I was in New South Wales government, which still remains, I think, the best investment per dollar, I think, of any government decision in the history of Australia. We invested about $200,000 or $300,000 in consultant fees. The resulting impact has been, I don't know, $10-20 billion worth of growth along that coal chain. But to do that, the kcal emissions the kcal energy output was about 6,000, right? Which is pretty clean. That's pretty good high grade thermal coal. Adani is the same that you get in, you know, sort of shitty Indonesian coal of about 5,000. It's not very, you know, I think it goes for about $60-something on the global market. I don't see how you build the infrastructure needed. You mine the thing. I mean, I think it's going to get right to the point of approval and then flogged off. Is going to be my.
In politics, perception counts, and clearly those seats in central and northern Queensland, these huge swings of anywhere between 6 and 12%. A lot of that was driven by a backlash about.
It is, and we shouldn't allow ourselves to get written into a part where Adani is this one central thing that we need to be pro or anti.
Interesting what the Premier did a few days ago. Anastasia Palaszczuk, hasn't she seen the writing on the wall? Now she's going to support Adani.
I think everyone's going to support Adani. I don't think Adani's going to support Adani.
Fair enough. And with that, Sam, especially given recent history, really appreciate you showing up here. So everyone, please join me in thanking.